close your eyes for a moment, if you will, and let the world grow quiet. Imagine a cool September evening somewhere in Central Europe. The year is 1939. The air smells of late summer, of cut grass and wood smoke, and the faint, faraway trace of autumn trying to arrive before its time. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls. A dog barks once and then falls silent. Leaves drift from the linden trees, turning slowly, catching what little light remains in the fading sky. Most people in the villages and the cities and the farmhouses of Europe are going about their ordinary lives tonight. They are eating dinner. They are tucking children into beds. They are reading by lamplight and listening to the radio and trying not to think too hard about the whispers that have been growing louder now for years. Whispers of tension, of treaties, of armies moving in the dark at the edges of the world. But history, as it always does, was about to arrive without an invitation. Tonight, we begin a journey back through time, not to the thunder of cannons or the roar of tanks, but to the quiet, complicated, deeply human story of how the Second World War truly began. Not the version you learned in school, exactly, but the fuller, richer, stranger truth that lives in the details. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let the story carry you. We want to thank you for supporting us. It would mean so much if you could support the channel by leaving a like and subscribing to help us keep this channel going. Anyways, back to the video. To understand how the Second World War began, we must first understand the world that made it possible. And that world, bruised, bewildered, still stumbling from the wreckage of one catastrophe, was not so different from worlds we might recognize today. Let's go back, then. Further back than September 1939. Further back than Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933. Further back even than the crash of 1929, which shook the global economy to its foundations. We must go all the way back to the guns falling silent in November 1918, when the First World War ended and the survivors looked out across a devastated continent and asked, with exhausted wonder, what now? The answer they were given, or rather, the answer imposed upon them at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, would plant the seeds of everything that followed. Picture, if you will, a grand hall in Versailles, just outside Paris. The Hall of Mirrors. 17 meters of ceiling stretching above the heads of diplomats from nearly 30 nations, all of them gathered to decide the fate of a world still raw with grief. The golden light of chandeliers falling on men in dark suits, men in military uniforms, men carrying leather folders stuffed with maps and proposals and grievances that stretched back generations. On one side, the victors, Britain, France, the United States, Italy, and their allies, worn and triumphant. On the other, conspicuously absent, the defeated nations. Germany was not invited to negotiate. She would be told what she had agreed to. That distinction, small as it might seem, would echo through the following decades like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. The treaty that emerged from those long months of argument and compromise was called the Treaty of Versailles, and it would become one of the most consequential documents in modern history, not for what it achieved, but for the fury it ignited. Germany, under the terms of this treaty, was to accept full responsibility for the war. Article 231 of the treaty, which would become known, bitterly, as the War Guilt Clause, stated that Germany and her allies were responsible for all the loss and damage caused by a war imposed upon the Allied nations. This was not simply a legal formality. It was a moral judgment, stamped in ink, pressed into the national consciousness of a proud and traumatized people. Beyond the psychological wound, there were practical ones. Germany lost territory, significant territory. Alsace-Lorraine went back to France. The Polish corridor was carved out, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The Rhineland was to be occupied by Allied troops. The German military was reduced to a rump force, 100,000 soldiers, no air force, a token navy. And reparations, enormous financial penalties, were demanded. The final bill, eventually set in 1921, was 132 billion gold marks. A sum so vast that Germany would not finish paying it until, and this is not a metaphor, this is literal, the year 2010. Now, Imagine being German in 1919. Imagine the feeling. Your country had not been invaded. There had been no foreign soldiers marching through Berlin. The war ended with German troops still standing on foreign soil. And yet here, in this humiliating document, you were told that everything, the millions of dead, the destroyed cities, the broken families, the poisoned fields of France and Belgium, all of it was your fault. All of it was your responsibility. All of it would be paid for by your children and your children's children. The German word the people began to use was Dolchstoßlegend, the stab-in-the-back legend. The idea that Germany had not truly lost the war on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by socialists, by politicians, by Jews, by those who had surrendered too soon, who had undermined the military from within. This legend was false, but it was powerful, and it filled a vacuum that the treaty had created. The political economist John Maynard Keynes, who had attended the Paris conference as a young British advisor, resigned in disgust and immediately wrote a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. He predicted, with startling accuracy, that the punitive terms of the treaty would destabilize Europe, breed resentment, and ultimately produce a second, worse catastrophe. He was ignored. He was right. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let us sit with the world of 1919 and early 1920 and try to feel the atmosphere, the strange mixture of relief and despair, of hope and exhaustion, of nations trying to rebuild what had been destroyed while carrying the weight of what had been taken. In Germany, the Weimar Republic, the new democratic government born from the ashes of the Kaiser's empire, was trying to hold together a nation that was coming apart at the seams. On the left, communist revolutionaries inspired by what had happened in Russia in 1917 were attempting to spark their own revolution. On the right, nationalist groups, many of them composed of former soldiers who had never quite come home from the war, were forming paramilitary organizations and dreaming of vengeance. In Munich, a young man with a small mustache and intense, pale eyes was making speeches in beer halls, drawing crowds that grew a little larger each time. His name was Adolf Hitler, and he had been a corporal in the war, a runner, a dispatch carrier who moved messages through the shelling and the gas and the mud. He had been twice decorated for bravery, twice wounded, and had wept, genuinely wept, when he heard of the armistice. He had never fully recovered from that weeping. He had turned the grief into something harder, something dangerous. But Hitler in 1919 was not yet the Hitler of the history books. He was one angry voice among many in a country full of angry voices. What made him different, what would eventually make him singular, was a combination of qualities that are worth understanding, not to admire them, but to understand how such a man could rise. He was, first of all, a gifted orator, not gifted in the way of eloquent statesmen who construct careful arguments and marshal evidence. His gift was rawer and more visceral than that. He understood how to feel what an audience felt, how to name the humiliation and the rage that lived in the pit of the stomach, how to give formless resentment a target and a shape. When he spoke of German betrayal, of German greatness, of the enemies who had conspired against the German people, his listeners felt recognized. They felt that finally, here was someone who understood. He was also, and this is crucial to understand, a man of extraordinary patience when patience served his ends, and extraordinary recklessness when caution did not. He would wait for years, building slowly, and then move with a speed and audacity that left his opponents blinking. He combined a mystic's conviction with a gambler's instincts. And in the broken, desperate Germany of the 1920s, that combination was lethal. But let us not skip too quickly to the 1930s. The 1920s are worth dwelling in because they contain a lesson we often overlook, the lesson of opportunity lost. There was a moment, several moments, really, when the catastrophe that was coming might have been avoided. This is perhaps the most haunting truth about the origins of the Second World War. It was not inevitable. At multiple points in the long decade between the end of one war and the beginning of another, choices were made by individuals, by governments, by nations, that closed off paths toward peace and opened paths toward destruction. The 1920s began badly, with the reparations crisis, and the hyperinflation that would eventually make German currency so worthless that people burned banknotes for warmth. But they improved. The Dawes Plan of 1924, organized largely by American banker Charles Dawes, restructured Germany's debt payments and injected American capital into the German economy. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 seemed to signal a new era of reconciliation. Germany accepted its western borders, France and Britain agreed to a kind of mutual guarantee system, and Germany was admitted to the League of Nations in 1926. These were genuine achievements. The late 1920s brought a period of stability and even prosperity to Germany and the Nazi Party, which had made a spectacular and unsuccessful attempt to seize power in Munich in 1923. The Beer Hall Putsch, a fiasco that landed Hitler in prison, seemed to be fading. In the elections of 1928, the Nazis won only 2.6% of the vote. They were a fringe party, a curiosity. Then came October 1929, the Wall Street crash. The Great Depression that followed the crash moved through the global economy like a slow-motion wave, leaving devastation in its wake. In Germany, the effect was particularly severe because the German economic recovery of the mid-1920s had been built largely on American loans. When those loans were called in, the structure collapsed. Unemployment, which had been falling, began to rise, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. By 1932, 1 in 3 German workers was unemployed. 6 million people, at the peak, had no work. And behind those 6 million were their families, their wives, their children, their parents, all of them grinding through the slow desperation of poverty in a society that had already been humiliated, already been told it was guilty, already been asked to pay a debt it could never fully pay. Into that desperation stepped Adolf Hitler. And this time, the crowds were very much larger. The elections of 1930 saw the Nazi Party jump from 2.6% to 18.3%. By 1932, in successive elections, they would become the largest party in the Reichstag, the German parliament, though never with an outright majority. The story of how Hitler went from leader of the largest party to Chancellor of Germany is a story of miscalculation and arrogance on the part of Germany's conservative establishment, men who thought they could use him as a tool and control him afterward. They were wrong, but we are still getting ahead of ourselves. For now, as the hour grows late and the world outside grows quiet, let us simply sit with the knowledge that what became the Second World War was not a sudden explosion, but a slow accumulation of resentments, of failures, of missed opportunities, of small decisions that gradually narrowed the space available for peace. Every war has its origins in a world that chose not to prevent it. And the world of the 1920s and 1930s, with all its complexity and all its tragedy, made its choices one by one in offices and parliaments and beer halls and drawing rooms across Europe, while ordinary people went about their lives and tried not to notice the storm gathering on the horizon. The storm was coming, though. It was always coming. And to understand how it arrived, we need to follow its path, quietly, slowly, the way you might trace the course of a river from its source in the mountains all the way down to the sea. Let us continue. There is a question that haunts historians and ordinary people alike when they look back at the Germany of the early 1930s. How did it happen? How did one of the most educated, culturally sophisticated nations in Europe hand power to a man whose ideas were so extreme, so brutal, so transparently contemptuous of human decency? How did the people of Goethe and Beethoven and Einstein come to follow Adolf Hitler? The answer is uncomfortable precisely because it is not simple. It is not a story of a nation of monsters. It is a story of fear and exhaustion and the way that ordinary human psychology can be weaponized when conditions are desperate enough. Let us trace the path carefully because it matters, not just as history, but as a lesson that belongs to all of us. By the summer of 1932, Germany was in political chaos. The Weimar Republic, the democratic government established after the First World War, had never been fully embraced by the German people. It had been born in defeat. The politicians who signed the armistice were called the November criminals by their enemies, and it carried that stigma throughout its existence. Worse, it had presided over hyperinflation economic collapse, and political violence that left the streets of German cities feeling dangerous and unstable. The elections of July 1932 were the critical turning point. The Nazi Party won 37.4% of the vote, their highest ever share in a free election. They were now undeniably the largest party in the Reichstag. But 37.4% was not a majority, and Hitler, when asked to join the government in a subordinate role, refused. He wanted the chancellorship, the top position, or nothing. The man who held the chancellorship at this point was Franz von Papen, an aristocratic conservative who was himself struggling to maintain any kind of parliamentary support. Behind the scenes, the aging President Paul von Hindenburg and his coterie of conservative advisors were maneuvering desperately, trying to find some combination of political forces that could produce a stable government without giving Hitler what he wanted. There is something almost darkly farcical about the political situation of late 1932 and early 1933, as seen from the comfortable distance of history. The men trying to outmaneuver Hitler, Hindenburg, Papen, the industrialists, the army generals, all believed they were smarter than him. All believed that his appeal was purely emotional, that behind the speeches there was no substance, that a man who had failed so spectacularly in 1923 and who had no experience of government could be kept in a box. They could not have been more wrong. In November 1932, a second election was held. The Nazi vote dropped from 37.4% to 33.1%. There were those who believed, watching these results, that the Nazi tide had peaked, that the crisis was passing, that the moment of maximum danger was over. It was not over. It was just beginning. On January 30th, 1933, after weeks of backroom negotiation, President von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Papen, who had engineered the deal, told his friends he had Hitler in his pocket. Within months, Hitler would be the most powerful man in Europe, and Papen would be running for his life. The mechanism by which a democracy becomes a dictatorship is rarely a sudden coup. It tends to be more subtle and more gradual, a series of steps, each of which seems defensible in isolation, each of which is explained away as temporary or necessary, or not really as significant as it appears. Germany in 1933 is the textbook case. Within a week of becoming chancellor, Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag and call new elections. He needed to build his majority. He needed, in other words, more democratic legitimacy before he could dispose of democracy altogether. Then, on the night of February 27, 1933, the Reichstag, the parliament building in the heart of Berlin, burned. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was caught at the scene, lighter fluid in his pocket, and confessed to setting the fire. Whether he acted alone, or was a patsy, or was part of a larger conspiracy, Nazi or otherwise, remains debated by historians to this day. What is beyond debate is what happened next. The following morning, Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties across Germany. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, the inviolability of the home, all of it suspended indefinitely in the name of national security. Communist and socialist leaders were arrested by the thousands. The election campaign continued, but now the opposition was operating in an atmosphere of terror. The elections of March 5, 1933, gave the Nazis 43.9% of the vote, still not a majority, but combined with their coalition partner, the conservative German National People's Party, enough to form a working majority. Then came the Enabling Act of March 23, 1933. This was the document that formally ended the Weimar Republic. It gave Hitler's cabinet the power to pass laws without the consent of the Reichstag, for 4 years, renewable. The Social Democrats voted against it. They were the only party with the courage to do so. Their leader, Otto Wels, gave a speech in the Reichstag that day that stands as one of the finest acts of political defiance in modern history. He told Hitler that no one could take from the Social Democrats their honor and their commitment to humanity, freedom, and justice. Hitler, when he responded, was contemptuous. He told the Social Democrats he did not want their votes. Germany would be free, he said, but not through them. The communists could not vote. Their deputies had been arrested. The Center Party, the Catholics, the other parties, they capitulated, calculating that cooperation was better than resistance, that perhaps things would not be as bad as they seemed, that perhaps they could moderate the extremes from within. They were wrong, as those who make that calculation in the face of totalitarianism almost always are. The Enabling Act passed 444 to 94. Germany's democracy voted itself out of existence. In the months that followed, the remaining political parties were either banned or dissolved themselves under pressure. Trade unions were abolished. The federal states lost their independence to the central government. The press was brought under control. Newspapers that had been critical of the Nazis were shuttered. Editors were replaced with party loyalists. A Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, headed by the brilliant and sinister Joseph Goebbels, began the task of managing what Germans saw and heard and read and thought. By the end of 1933, Germany was, to all intents and purposes, a one-party state. And Adolf Hitler was its undisputed leader. But here's what the history books sometimes fail to capture: the texture of ordinary life in Germany during these months and years. Because alongside the terror, the arrests, the beatings, the concentration camps that were already opening their gates, there was something else happening. Something that complicates the picture enormously. The economy was improving. Hitler's government launched a massive program of public works, highways, buildings, infrastructure, that put Germans back to work. Unemployment, which had stood at 6 million in 1932, fell to 4 million in 1933, 3 million in 1934, 2 million in 1935, and by 1938 was virtually eliminated. This was achieved partly through genuine investment and partly through rearmament, which was itself a violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and partly through clever financial manipulation. But for a German family that had been eating scraps and watching their savings evaporate into worthlessness, the improvement was real and viscerally felt. There was also the restoration of national pride. The humiliations of Versailles, the sense of shame and defeat that had hung over Germany for 15 years. Hitler seemed to be erasing them one by one. When he marched troops back into the Rhineland in 1936, in open defiance of the treaty, and neither Britain nor France lifted a finger to stop him, the German people felt something that had been absent for a generation. They felt powerful. They felt respected. They felt that their nation had reclaimed its rightful place in the world. Many Germans, many ordinary, decent Germans who were not Nazis, who did not share the party's ideology, who might have been appalled by the worst of what was happening in those early years, looked at the economic recovery and the restoration of national prestige and made a kind of bargain with themselves. Things were not perfect. There were aspects of the regime they did not like, aspects they did not ask too many questions about. But their children were eating, their neighbors had jobs, Germany was strong again. Perhaps it would be all right. This is the human reality of how catastrophes develop. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, as people make small compromises and small adjustments and tell themselves that tomorrow will be better, that things could be worse, that the alternative was chaos. And all the while, quietly, in the margins, the machinery of what was to come was being assembled. Now let us turn our attention, as gently as we can, away from Germany for a moment, and look at the broader European picture. Because the story of how the war began is not only a story about Germany. It is a story about the whole of Europe, about the choices made by Britain and France, and the Soviet Union and the United States, and a dozen smaller nations, all of them trying to navigate an increasingly dangerous world with tools and strategies that were badly suited to the task. Britain in the 1930s was governed by a succession of conservative governments that were, in general, deeply reluctant to confront the gathering danger. This reluctance has been much criticized, and the policy that embodied it, known as appeasement, has become a byword for the futility of trying to placate an aggressor. But it is worth trying to understand why appeasement seemed, to many serious people at the time, like a reasonable and even necessary strategy. The memory of the First World War was still fresh and raw in British society. Virtually every family had lost someone: a father, a son, a brother, a husband. The trenches, the gas, the machine guns, the mud of Passchendaele and the Somme. These were not abstract historical events to the people making policy in the 1930s. They were personal traumas, lived experiences, nightmares that woke grown men in the dark. The idea of another war, another mass slaughter, was genuinely, viscerally horrifying in a way that is difficult to convey to generations that did not live through it. There was also a genuine belief, in some quarters, that Germany had been treated unfairly at Versailles, that the war guilt clause and the reparations and the territorial losses had been unjust, that if Germany's legitimate grievances were addressed, if the wrongs of 1919 were corrected, then the aggressive energies of the Nazi regime would be satisfied and peace could be preserved. This was not an unreasonable analysis, as far as it went. The problem was that it fundamentally misread Hitler. Hitler did not want to revise Versailles. He did not want a Germany that was treated fairly within the existing international order. He wanted to overturn that order entirely. He wanted German domination of Europe. He wanted Lebensraum, living space, in the East, taken by force from the Slavic peoples he considered racially inferior. He wanted, in the end, something that no amount of diplomatic concessions could satisfy. But understanding this required looking at what Hitler had actually written and said, and taking it seriously, and that too many in the 1930s were unwilling to do. It was easier to assume that the inflammatory rhetoric was just politics, that once in power, governing would moderate his extremes, that the realities of diplomacy would sand down the sharp edges of his ideology. They were wrong. The rhetoric was the reality. And by the time most of them understood this, it was very nearly too late. Let us rest here for a moment. Close your eyes and breathe. Let the weight of these events settle gently, the way snow settles on cold ground, softly, quietly, without rushing. The world we have been describing is not our world, and yet it is recognizable. The dynamics of fear and pride and economic desperation, the temptation to look away from uncomfortable truths, the difficulty of distinguishing between a negotiable grievance and an absolute demand. These are not confined to the 1930s. They are part of the permanent furniture of human affairs. The story continues. There is a story within the story of how the Second World War began, a story that is less well known, but perhaps more revealing than the more famous episodes. It is the story of how the international community, in the years before the war, had multiple opportunities to stop what was coming and failed every time to take them. To understand this, we need to talk about a concept that was in the 1930s still new enough to be idealistic: collective security. The idea, embodied in the League of Nations, was simple and appealing. If all nations agreed that an attack on any one of them was an attack on all of them, and if all nations agreed to respond collectively to any aggressor, then no single aggressor, however powerful, could hope to succeed. The cost of aggression would always outweigh the gains. War, therefore, would become irrational and would eventually become obsolete. It was a beautiful idea. It was not, as it turned out, a practical one. Because collective security requires that nations be willing to sacrifice their own immediate interests for the sake of the collective, and when the moment of testing came, nation after nation found that sacrifice too costly. The first great test came not in Europe, but in Africa. In October 1935, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, launched an invasion of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, also called Abyssinia, was one of the few African nations that had maintained its independence through the age of European colonialism. Its emperor, Haile Selassie, a dignified and eloquent man, came to the League of Nations and appealed for help. The League, in theory, had the tools to respond. It could impose economic sanctions, oil, steel, coal, that would have strangled Italy's war economy and forced Mussolini to retreat. Britain and France, the dominant powers in the League, had the influence to make such sanctions effective. They did not. What happened instead was a half measure. The League voted for partial sanctions, cutting off some exports to Italy, but not oil, which was the crucial one. The reason was complex and not entirely discreditable. Britain and France both feared that pushing Mussolini too hard would drive him into Hitler's arms. They were already alarmed by the growing power of Nazi Germany and did not want to make an enemy of Italy unnecessarily. The result of this calculation was that they made an enemy of Ethiopia and demonstrated to every would-be aggressor in the world that the League of Nations was willing to make gestures but unwilling to pay real costs. Mussolini conquered Ethiopia. Haile Selassie went into exile, and the lesson drawn in Tokyo and Berlin and Rome was that the international community would protest loudly and do very little. Then came Spain. In July 1936, a military uprising against the elected Republican government of Spain ignited a civil war that would last 3 years and consume nearly 500,000 lives. The war quickly became a proxy conflict. The forces of fascism on one side, the forces of communism and democracy, in varying and often conflicting combinations, on the other. Hitler and Mussolini supported the rebel nationalist forces of General Francisco Franco. The Soviet Union supported the Republicans. Britain and France, trying desperately to avoid being drawn in, adopted a policy of non-intervention, which was in practice a policy of abandonment, since everyone could see that Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union were intervening. The Spanish Civil War was many things: a national tragedy, a human catastrophe, a laboratory for the new weapons and tactics that would soon be used on a far larger scale. The German Condor Legion tested its aircraft and its bombing techniques over Spanish cities. The destruction of Guernica, bombed into rubble by German planes on a market day in April 1937, killing hundreds of civilians, was immortalized by Picasso's anguished painting and became, for those willing to see it, a preview of what German air power would do to Europe. But in the chancelleries of Britain and France, the lesson drawn was not urgency. It was caution. The Spanish Civil War reinforced the perception that any involvement in European conflicts risked leading to something far worse. The solution, always the solution, in these years was to stay out, to hope that things would stabilize, to trust that reason would eventually prevail. Meanwhile, in Germany, the pace of rearmament was accelerating. In March 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, moving troops back into the demilitarized zone that the Treaty of Versailles had established as a buffer between Germany and France. This was a direct violation of the treaty. It was also, as Hitler himself later admitted, his most dangerous gamble. His generals had advised him that if France mobilized and moved against the German troops, the German army would have to retreat in humiliation. Hitler overruled them and gambled that France would not act. He was right. The French government debated, delayed, consulted their British allies, and ultimately did nothing. Part of the reason was military. France had convinced itself that it was not ready for a military confrontation. Part of the reason was political. There was an election coming, and war was unpopular. And part of the reason was that deep-rooted uncertainty about whether Germany was actually doing anything illegal by stationing its own troops on its own territory. But the effect was devastating. Hitler had called the bluff of the Western powers, and they had folded. His authority within Germany was now immense. He had delivered results. He had defied the hated treaty, and nothing had happened to him. His confidence in his own judgment, never inconsiderable, became something close to absolute. In November 1937, Hitler gathered his senior military commanders and his foreign minister in a secret meeting that would only become known after the war through a document called the Hossbach Memorandum. There, he laid out his intentions with remarkable clarity. Germany needed to expand, he said. The question was not whether, but how and when. He wanted Austria and Czechoslovakia absorbed into Germany by 1943 to 45 at the latest, and possibly much sooner if the opportunity arose. The living space of the German people could only be secured by force. There was no alternative. His generals, hearing this, were troubled. Some argued that Germany was not yet strong enough, that the risks were too great. Hitler heard them out and dismissed their concerns. He had a clearer understanding, he believed, of what the democracies would and would not do. He was about to test that understanding in a series of moves that would bring Europe to the brink of war before, finally, pushing it over. Let us pause here again in the quiet space between facts. Let the history breathe around you like the cool air of an autumn night. Outside, if you listen carefully, there's only the sound of the world at rest. The wind in the leaves, the distant murmur of traffic, the small, ordinary sounds of life continuing. In the years between 1933 and 1938, Europe was like a patient who knows something is wrong but cannot bring himself to hear the diagnosis. Every symptom was explainable away. Every alarm was dismissed as excessive. Every crisis passed, somehow, always somehow, without becoming the war everyone dreaded. But the fuse was burning, and it was growing shorter. The year 1938 is where the story of how the Second World War began becomes most vivid, most immediate, and most heartbreaking. It is the year in which Europe came as close as it ever would to choosing a different path, and then chose the one that led, 12 months later, to catastrophe. It began in Austria. Austria and Germany shared a language, a culture, and deep historical ties. The idea of uniting the two countries, Anschluss, meaning union or annexation, had roots going back to the 19th century. After the First World War, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed and Austria found itself a small country of 7 million people with an oversized capital and a struggling economy, there had been genuine popular support for union with Germany. But the Treaty of Versailles and later the Treaty of Saint-Germain had explicitly forbidden it. The victorious powers did not want a larger, stronger Germany. By 1938, the political situation in Austria was already deeply compromised. The country had its own authoritarian government, led since 1934 by Kurt Schuschnigg, who had suspended the constitution and ruled by decree. But Austria's independence was increasingly fictitious. Germany had economic leverage, significant Nazi sympathizers within Austria, and Hitler's personal obsession with his homeland. In February 1938, Hitler summoned Schuschnigg to Berchtesgaden, his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, and subjected him to hours of intimidation, threats, and demands. Hitler ranted about Germany's military power and Austria's vulnerability. He demanded that Austria's Nazi party be legalized, that Austrian Nazis be given control of key government ministries, and that Austria's foreign policy be effectively subordinated to Germany's. Schuschnigg, pale and shaken, returned to Vienna. He made one last attempt to save Austrian independence, announcing a referendum in which Austrians would vote on whether they wished to remain free. He was gambling that the Austrian people, given a choice, would choose independence over annexation. Hitler did not give him the chance to find out. Under pressure, ultimatums backed by the threat of German military force, Schuschnigg resigned. The German army marched into Austria on March 12, 1938. Hitler himself crossed into the country of his birth the following day. He had expected, perhaps, a mixed reception. What he received was something close to a hero's welcome. The streets of Vienna were lined with crowds throwing flowers. German and Austrian Nazis paraded together. The majority of Austrians, traumatized by years of economic crisis and political instability, stirred by nationalist feeling, or simply pragmatic enough to accept what could not be changed, seemed to embrace the Union. There were others, of course. The Jews of Vienna, a community that had been central to the cultural and intellectual life of the city for generations, watched the crowds and felt a very different emotion. Within hours of the German arrival, anti-Jewish violence began. Jewish men and women were forced to scrub pavements on their knees while crowds watched and laughed. Synagogues were vandalized. Arrests began. The long nightmare that had been underway in Germany for 5 years arrived in Austria overnight. But the world's attention in those March days of 1938 was focused not on the Jews of Vienna, but on the diplomatic crisis of Anschluss. And what the world noticed was that Britain and France had done nothing. There had been protests, formal, polite, ineffectual protests. There had been no ultimatums, no mobilization, no threat of force. The message was received clearly in Berlin. Next came Czechoslovakia, and this is where the story becomes both more complex and more desperate. Czechoslovakia was, in many ways, the most successful of the states created after the First World War. It was a genuine democracy with a functioning parliament, an independent judiciary, and a well-educated population. Its economy was among the strongest in Central Europe. Its military was competent and well-equipped, with fortifications along its western borders that were considered, by military experts, to be formidable. But Czechoslovakia had a problem that Hitler intended to exploit. Along its western border, in the region known as the Sudetenland, lived approximately 3 million ethnic Germans. These Sudeten Germans had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and had found themselves, after 1919, citizens of a Czechoslovak state that they had not chosen and that many of them resented. Their political grievances were, to some extent, legitimate questions of cultural autonomy, language rights, economic opportunity. But those legitimate grievances were being deliberately inflamed and manipulated by the Nazi Party, which had been organizing among the Sudeten Germans throughout the 1930s. By spring 1938, the leader of the Sudeten German Party, Konrad Henlein, who was secretly taking his instruction from Berlin, was making demands that were designed to be rejected. He wanted, in effect, self-government for the Sudetenland within Czechoslovakia. But every time the Czech government moved to meet his demands, he raised them. The purpose was not negotiation. The purpose was to create a pretext. Through the summer of 1938, Europe held its breath. Hitler ratcheted up the pressure, making speeches, staging military exercises along the Czech border, orchestrating propaganda that portrayed the Sudeten Germans as a suffering minority crushed under the heel of Czech oppression. The French, who had a treaty obligation to defend Czechoslovakia, were terrified. The British, who did not have such an obligation but were deeply entangled in the diplomacy, were scrambling to find a solution. Enter Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain has become perhaps the most controversial political figure of the 20th century, a man whose name is synonymous with the folly of appeasement, whose image holding a piece of paper and declaring peace for our time has become one of the defining photographs of the era. He deserves a more nuanced treatment than he usually receives, even if the ultimate verdict cannot be kind. He was 69 years old in 1938, a man of the Victorian era, set in his ways, deeply uncomfortable with military solutions, genuinely horrified by the prospect of another war. He was also, in his own estimation and in the estimation of many around him, a formidable negotiator who could size up another man and make a deal where lesser men failed. He was catastrophically wrong about Hitler. In September 1938, Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times to negotiate directly with Hitler. This was unprecedented. No British Prime Minister had ever done such a thing. At their first meeting at Berchtesgaden, Chamberlain was willing to concede, in principle, that the Sudeten Germans had the right to join Germany. At their second meeting at Bad Godesberg, he discovered that Hitler had raised his demands further. He now wanted immediate military occupation of the Sudetenland, not a negotiated transfer. Chamberlain returned to London shaken and appalled. For a brief, extraordinary moment, it seemed as though war was inevitable. France and Britain began to mobilize. Trenches were dug in British parks. Gas masks were distributed to civilians. A Royal Navy fleet was placed on alert. Czech troops manned their fortifications. And then came Munich. On September 29th to 30th, 1938, Chamberlain, Daladier of France, Hitler, and Mussolini met in Munich. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the conference that would decide her fate. The Soviet Union, which had its own treaty obligations to Czechoslovakia, was not invited. In the small hours of September 30th, an agreement was signed. Czechoslovakia would cede the Sudetenland to Germany immediately. In exchange, the remaining borders of Czechoslovakia would be guaranteed by the great powers. Chamberlain flew home to Heston Aerodrome and spoke to the crowds that met him with the words that would become infamous. He waved a paper, the Anglo-German declaration that he and Hitler had signed separately from the Munich Agreement, and declared that he believed it was peace for our time. The crowd cheered. Britain was flooded with relief. It did not last. Within 6 months, in March 1939, Hitler violated every commitment he had made at Munich. German troops marched into Prague. Czechoslovakia was dismembered, its western portion becoming the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, under German occupation, and its eastern portion becoming the nominally independent, German-aligned state of Slovakia. The lie that Hitler's aggression was about uniting German-speaking peoples was now naked and visible. Czechs were not Germans. The occupation of Prague had nothing to do with ethnicity or self-determination. It was conquest, pure and simple. In London and Paris, something finally shifted. Public opinion, which had been so desperate for peace that it had accepted Munich as a necessary evil, now hardened. The newspapers that had praised Chamberlain's diplomacy began to turn. In Parliament, Winston Churchill, who had been warning, largely unheeded, about the Nazi danger for years, spoke with bitter clarity. He told the House of Commons that Britain had chosen between war and dishonor, and had chosen dishonor, and would have war as well. But Chamberlain, whatever his private torment, maintained his course a while longer. He drew what he called a clear line, guaranteeing the independence of Poland. France followed. If Germany attacked Poland, Britain and France would fight. Now we come to the question that is almost never asked. Why Poland? Of all the countries in Europe, why was Poland the one whose invasion finally triggered the war? Czechoslovakia had been abandoned. Austria had been swallowed. Memel, a small Lithuanian port with a German population, had been seized just days after Prague. Why, after so many retreats, did the line hold at Poland? The answer involves a fundamental shift in perception, a recognition, finally, that Hitler could not be appeased because his goals were unlimited. The fall of Prague had demonstrated this. And the guarantee to Poland was not a calculation that Poland was worth dying for in a way that Czechoslovakia was not. It was a recognition that if this line was not held, there would be no line at all. The guarantee was also, if we're being honest, a bluff. Britain and France had no realistic way to defend Poland militarily. Poland was simply too far away, too large to be reinforced, too exposed to attack from too many directions. The guarantee was a statement of intent, a diplomatic message, but it was not a military plan. Hitler did not believe in it. He had watched Britain and France back down so many times that he could not imagine they would actually fight over Poland. This was his crucial miscalculation, and it is perhaps the most important answer to the question of how the war began. The war began because Hitler misjudged his opponents. He was right that they were reluctant to fight. He was wrong that they were infinitely reluctant. He pushed until he found the limit, and by the time he found it, it was too late to stop. Let's breathe again. Let the night deepen around you. The story is still unfolding, and there are more layers to uncover, layers that bring us closer to that first morning of September 1939 and to the strange, complicated truth of what the war really was and how it really started. Of all the surprises in the long story of how the Second World War began, perhaps the most stunning, the most genuinely shocking to contemporaries, was the announcement that came on August 23, 1939, a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. To understand why this was so astonishing, you need to understand the ideological gulf that was supposed to separate these two regimes. For years, Nazism and communism had presented themselves as mortal enemies, the ultimate expression of two irreconcilable worldviews. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf about the Jewish Bolshevist conspiracy that he intended to destroy. Stalin had warned for years about fascist aggression. The Spanish Civil War had been fought, in part, as a proxy war between these two systems. The idea of a deal between them seemed, to most observers in most capitals, not just unlikely, but impossible. It was not impossible. It was inevitable, in retrospect, given the logic of the two regimes and the diplomatic situation of the summer of 1939. To understand the Soviet perspective, we need to understand Stalin's reading of the situation. He was watching the Western powers' behavior with cold, calculating eyes, and what he saw was not reassuring. Britain and France had appeased Hitler through Czechoslovakia. They had, in his view, been trying to channel German aggression eastward, try to buy peace for themselves by pointing the Nazi war machine at the Soviet Union. The Munich Conference, from which the Soviet Union had been excluded, confirmed this suspicion. The West, Stalin concluded, could not be trusted as an ally. If the Soviet Union was to survive, It would have to look after itself. Throughout the spring and early summer of 1939, there were negotiations between Britain, France, and the Soviet Union about a possible collective security arrangement. But the talks were half-hearted on the British and French side. There were deep ideological reservations about associating too closely with Stalin's regime and serious practical difficulties about what a mutual defense arrangement would actually look like when the Soviet Union shared no border with Germany except through Poland. Poland, for its part, absolutely refused to allow Soviet troops on its territory. The Poles had fought and won a war against the Soviets in 1920 and had no desire to invite them back. Meanwhile, Germany was approaching the Soviet Union with its own proposal. Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, flew to Moscow on August 23, 1939. He was received by Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, and by Stalin himself. The negotiations were remarkably quick. Within hours, a pact was agreed. The public text was a non-aggression agreement. Neither power would attack the other, and neither would support a third power that attacked the other. Germany and the Soviet Union were simply, neutrally, promising not to fight each other. But there was a secret protocol, and the secret protocol changed the map of Eastern Europe. The secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and the eastern part of Poland would fall under Soviet influence. Lithuania and the western part of Poland would fall under German influence. Lithuania was later adjusted, given to the Soviet sphere, in exchange for a larger slice of Poland going to Germany. In other words, Stalin and Hitler had, in a single evening's negotiation, effectively agreed to divide the nations between them. Poland, which had guaranteed nothing and agreed to nothing, was to be cut in half. The Baltic states, which had gained their independence after the First World War at enormous cost, were to be handed back to Soviet domination. The news, when it broke on the morning of August 24th, caused consternation across Europe and the world. In France, the Communist Party, which had been among the most vocal opponents of fascism, was thrown into ideological turmoil. In Britain, the foreign policy calculations of the past months suddenly looked very different. In Warsaw, the government looked at the situation and saw that it was effectively alone. Hitler had secured his eastern flank. He no longer needed to fear a two-front war, the nightmare that had haunted German strategic thinking since the 19th century and that had ultimately contributed to the defeat in the First World War. With the Soviet Union neutralized, he could turn his full force westward. But why did Stalin do it? Why did the man who had spent years warning about fascist aggression suddenly make a deal with the arch-fascist? The answer is both simple and deeply pragmatic. Stalin was buying time. He knew, or strongly suspected, that Germany would eventually turn on the Soviet Union, that the ideological conflict between Nazism and communism was too fundamental to be permanently resolved by a piece of paper. But he needed more time to rebuild the Red Army, which had been devastated by his purges of the officer corps in 1937 to 38, when he had executed or imprisoned tens of thousands of officers, including most of the high command, out of paranoia about potential rivals. The deal with Germany bought him that time, or so he thought. In the event, it bought him 22 months before Hitler violated it in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa. Whether those 22 months were enough is one of the great counterfactual questions of the war. What the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did, in the short term, was remove the last obstacle to Hitler's invasion of Poland. On September 1st, 1939, at dawn, the German invasion began. But here is what the history books often pass over too quickly in their haste to get to the main events of the war. The days between the announcement of the pact and the beginning of the invasion were filled with frantic diplomatic activity that came agonizingly close, more than once, to producing a last-minute solution. Mussolini, alarmed by the prospect of a European war that he did not think Italy was ready for, proposed a conference, another Munich, effectively. Britain and France were ambivalent. Hitler was uninterested. The proposal came to nothing. Within Germany itself, there were men in the military, in the foreign ministry, in the small and courageous German resistance, who were trying to find ways to stop what was coming. One of them was Karl Goerdeler, a former mayor of Leipzig who had been building a network of anti-Nazi contacts. Another was Hans Oster, a senior officer in the Abwehr, German military intelligence, who was secretly in contact with foreign governments. These men and their associates would spend the war years trying and failing to remove Hitler from power. In August 1939, they were watching the countdown to invasion with dread, trying to find any lever they could pull. They found none. The countdown reached zero, and at 4:45 in the morning on September 1st, 1939, the guns began to speak. Let us pause once more in the story and let the quiet of this late hour surround you. The world outside is still. Whatever sounds you can hear, the soft hum of the night, the distant movement of the city or the countryside, let them be the background of this moment. Take a long, slow breath. We are approaching the beginning, or what most people think of as the beginning. But there is more to understand about what happened next, about the strange and tragic first weeks of the war, about what Poland endured, about how Britain and France finally, reluctantly, irrevocably stepped into the conflict. It is September 1st, 1939. The pre-dawn air over the Polish plains is cool and still. Dew lies heavy on the grass. In the farms and villages of western Poland, most people are asleep. The harvest is still underway. It has been a good summer, warm and plentiful. There is the ordinary smell of hay and earth, and the first hint of autumn in the air. Then the ground begins to shake. The German attack on Poland has become famous in the popular imagination as the First Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. And indeed, it was a display of military coordination and speed that shocked the world. Germany committed 62 divisions, including 6 armored divisions equipped with tanks and over 1.5 million soldiers. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, sent nearly 3,000 aircraft. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, from Germany in the west and north, from German-controlled Czechoslovakia in the south. Poland was attacked on its front, its flanks, and ultimately its rear. But the story of the Polish campaign of September 1939 contains much that the popular narrative obscures. First, Poland fought back. This seems obvious, but it needs to be stated clearly because there is a strand of popular history, particularly in Western Europe and America, that treats Poland's defeat as somehow rapid or inevitable, almost as a foregone conclusion. It was not. Polish soldiers fought with extraordinary bravery and, given the circumstances, considerable effectiveness. The Polish army was not the antiquated horse cavalry force of caricature. Yes, it had cavalry, but Polish cavalry were highly mobile light infantry who used horses primarily for transportation, not for charging machine guns. The Polish armed forces were, by the standards of the time, a modern and capable fighting force. They were heavily outnumbered and outgunned, certainly. They were in an almost impossible strategic situation, surrounded on 3 sides and with their industrial heartland dangerously exposed. But they fought. The Polish Air Force, though it possessed only about 400 operational combat aircraft against Germany's thousands, inflicted significant losses on the Luftwaffe in the opening days. Polish ground forces mounted successful counterattacks in several sectors. At the Battle of Bzura, in mid-September, a Polish force of nearly 200,000 men launched a massive counterattack against the German flank that came close, for a time, to threatening the entire German advance. It was the largest battle of the Polish campaign, and the outcome was uncertain for days before German superiority in numbers and equipment overwhelmed the Polish forces. Second, Poland's situation was transformed catastrophically on September 17, 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded from the east. This is the part of the story that is too often reduced to a footnote. On September 17, 16 days after the German invasion began, Soviet forces crossed Poland's eastern border and advanced into the territories that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had assigned to the Soviet sphere. The Soviets justified this as a response to the collapse of the Polish state, claiming to be protecting the Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities in eastern Poland. The effect was devastating. Poland was now caught between 2 invaders, attacked simultaneously from west and east. The Polish government, which had not abandoned the fight, found itself militarily unable to continue. President Ignacy Mościcki and the government fled across the Romanian border on September 18th, eventually establishing a government in exile, first in France, then in Britain, that would continue to represent Poland and contribute to the Allied war effort throughout the war. The city of Warsaw held out heroically, subjected to aerial bombardment and artillery fire, short of food and water. The civilian population endured with a fortitude that moved observers to write about it in almost reverent terms. The city finally surrendered on September 28th. Fortress Modlin held until October 2nd. The last regular Polish military unit did not surrender until October 6th. By then, Poland had been divided between Germany and the Soviet Union exactly as the secret protocol had stipulated. The western and central portions became part of the German Reich, or the German-occupied General Government Territory, administered by Hans Frank, who would go on to be one of the war's most brutal occupiers. The eastern portions came under Soviet control. What followed in both zones was a nightmare of organized terror that ranks among the worst crimes of the 20th century. In the German zone, the persecution of Jews began almost immediately. Forced labor, ghettos, confiscation of property, random violence. The concentration camp at Auschwitz, which would become the most notorious site of mass murder in human history, was established in the former Polish city of Oświęcim in June 1940. The systematic murder of Jews, what we now call the Holocaust, would not begin in earnest until 1941-42, but its roots were being planted in Poland from the first days of the occupation. In the Soviet zone, a different but equally terrible story was unfolding. Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, began arresting and deporting Polish citizens in 4 massive waves of deportations that would eventually send more than 1 million Poles to labor camps in Siberia and Soviet Central Asia. Police officers, military officers, landowners, teachers, intellectuals, priests, anyone who might form the backbone of resistance was targeted. And in April-May 1940, in the forests of Katyn and in other sites, NKVD officers executed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intellectuals who had been held in Soviet prisoner-of-war camps. The massacre was kept secret by the Soviets for decades. It was not officially acknowledged until 1990. For 50 years, the Soviet Union and its allies blamed the massacre on the Germans. This is what the invasion of Poland really was. Not a quick military skirmish that opened the war before the real action moved to France and Britain. It was the beginning of a systematic attempt to destroy Poland as a nation, to kill or deport its leadership, to enslave its population, to erase its identity. Poland lost more than 6 million people in the war, roughly 20% of its pre-war population, a proportional loss greater than any other country. And yet, even in defeat, Poland continued to fight. Polish pilots would fly for the RAF in the Battle of Britain and would be among its most effective defenders. Polish soldiers would serve in North Africa and at Monte Cassino. Polish mathematicians, before the war, had broken the Enigma cipher machine that the Germans used for their military communications and had given the broken cipher to Britain and France just weeks before the invasion, a contribution to Allied intelligence that would prove, in the course of the war, to be priceless. Now let us turn to the strange, frozen weeks that followed Germany's invasion of Poland, the period that would become known in the West as the Phony War. Britain and France had declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939, 2 days after the invasion began, and after delivering ultimatums to Berlin that received no response. The scene of Britain's declaration of war is one of the most distinctive in this entire history. Chamberlain spoke to the nation on BBC Radio at 11:15 on the morning of September 3rd. His voice was tired, sorrowful, the voice of a man who had spent 2 years trying to prevent this moment and had failed. He told the British people that they were now at war with Germany and concluded with words that carry a particular poignancy. Everything I have worked for, everything I have hoped for, everything I believed in during my public life has crashed in ruins. Within minutes of the broadcast, the air raid sirens sounded over London. People rushed to their shelters and put on their gas masks. It turned out to be a false alarm. a single French aircraft that had failed to properly identify itself. But the moment crystallized the terror of what everyone feared, that this war, unlike the last one, might come from the skies, might strike cities, might kill not soldiers in distant trenches, but ordinary people in their homes and streets. In the event, nothing happened. For 8 months, from September 1939 to April 1940, the war on the Western Front was eerily quiet. Britain sent its expeditionary force to France, where it dug in along the Belgian border. The French army, the largest in Europe, sat behind the Maginot Line, the enormous chain of fortifications built in the interwar years along the Franco-German border. The Germans sat on their side and waited. This was the phony war, the Sitzkrieg, sitting war, as the Germans called it with dry humor. There were occasional skirmishes, occasional patrols, occasional shots fired. At sea, the conflict was real enough. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, sinking Allied shipping, while the Royal Navy enforced a blockade of Germany. But on land, in France and Germany, the armies watched each other across their lines and did very little. Why the pause? On the German side, Hitler needed time to consolidate the conquest of Poland and to move forces westward. There were also diplomatic calculations, a hope, perhaps, that Britain and France might agree to a negotiated peace, having made their declaration of war and done essentially nothing. Hitler made a public offer in October 1939, vague, conditional, amounting to a demand that the Western powers accept the new European reality, including German occupation of Poland. It was refused. On the Allied side, the strategy, if it can be called that, was to wait for the blockade to work. Germany's access to raw materials, particularly oil, was already constrained. The theory was that over months, over years, shortages would wear down German military capability. Then, eventually, when the moment was right, the Allies could act from a position of strength. It was not a stupid strategy, exactly. Germany's vulnerability to blockade was real. But it rested on the assumption that Hitler would be patient, that he would wait for the Allies to set the terms of the conflict. He had other ideas entirely. But before we get to May 1940 and the invasion of France, before we reach the event that truly transformed the nature and scale of the war, there is one more episode that deserves our attention. A strange, small, almost forgotten war that took place in the winter of 1939 to 40 in the forests and frozen lakes of Finland. In the late autumn of 1939, Stalin looked at the map of his newly expanded empire and saw a problem. Finland, a country of moderate size, democratic, newly independent since 1917, sat uncomfortably close to Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second city and its most important northern port. The Finnish border came to within 32 kilometers of Leningrad. In an era of aircraft and modern artillery, this seemed to Stalin dangerously, unacceptably close. The Soviet Union began negotiating with Finland in October 1939, demanding territorial concessions, a buffer zone around Leningrad, a naval base on Finnish territory, some islands in the Gulf of Finland. In exchange, the Soviets offered Finland territory elsewhere, in Soviet Karelia. The Finns negotiated carefully and declined to accept terms that would compromise their sovereignty. They believed the Soviets were bluffing, or that international pressure would constrain Soviet action. They were wrong. On November 30th, 1939, Soviet forces invaded Finland without a declaration of war. The Winter War had begun. What happened next astonished the world. Finland, a country of just 4 million people, with a small army and no significant air force, held the Soviet Union at bay for 3.5 months. The Red Army, which Stalin had led into the invasion expecting a quick victory, perhaps a 2-week campaign, instead stumbled into disaster after disaster. The reasons for the initial Soviet failures were multiple. The Red Army was still recovering from the devastating officer purges of 1937 to 38, and many of the experienced commanders who might have organized effective combined arms operations had been shot or imprisoned. The Soviet soldiers who crossed the Finnish border were often poorly trained, poorly equipped for the extreme cold, temperatures that winter dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, and led by officers who were afraid to show initiative for fear of being accused of incompetence or, worse, political unreliability. The Finns, meanwhile, fought on terrain they knew intimately: forests, frozen lakes, narrow roads through dense woodland, and they employed tactics that exploited Soviet weaknesses with brilliant effectiveness. Small Finnish ski units, moving silently through the forest in white camouflage, attacked Soviet columns that were strung out along roads, unable to maneuver in the deep snow. They cut Soviet forces off from their supply lines, attacked them from multiple sides, eliminated their artillery and vehicles, and left them to freeze. The most dramatic of these battles was the destruction of the Soviet 44th Division at Suomussalmi in December 1939. The division, 17,000 men, was cut off, encircled, and systematically destroyed over the course of 3 weeks. When it was over, the road was littered with abandoned artillery, trucks, tanks, and the frozen bodies of thousands of Soviet soldiers. It became one of the most complete disasters in Soviet military history. Around the world, observers watched with fascination and no small degree of alarm. The Winter War seemed to confirm what many had long suspected, that Stalin's purges had so weakened the Red Army that it was barely capable of defeating a small European democracy. If the Soviets were this ineffective against Finland, the reasoning went, how effective could they possibly be against Germany? This reasoning would have enormous consequences. Hitler, watching the Soviet performance in Finland, concluded that the Red Army was a hollow force. This conclusion would powerfully reinforce his decision, already forming in his mind, to attack the Soviet Union. When he unleashed Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, he expected a campaign of perhaps 3 to 4 months, after which the whole rotten structure of the Soviet state would collapse. He was very nearly right in the terrifying early months of the campaign. But he was ultimately wrong, partly because he underestimated Soviet reserves of manpower and industrial capacity, and partly because the Red Army, given time, would find its voice again, reorganizing, relearning, developing commanders of genuine brilliance who would eventually turn the tide. The Winter War also had immediate political consequences. The Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations, one of the rare occasions when the League managed a decisive gesture, even if only a symbolic one. Britain and France, already at war with Germany, began discussing the possibility of also going to war with the Soviet Union, opening supply routes to Finland through Norway and Sweden. It was a measure of how confused and multi-directional Allied strategy had become that such discussions were seriously entertained. Finland eventually accepted peace on Soviet terms in March 1940, ceding the territories Stalin had originally demanded. The peace was bitter. Finland had fought brilliantly and lost more than 25,000 dead, but Finland remained independent. That independence was the thing that mattered most, and it was achieved at a cost in Soviet lives. Approximately 125,000 dead by Finnish estimates. That would haunt the Red Army for years. The Winter War ended. The Western Front remained frozen in its strange silence, and Hitler was planning. In Berlin, through the winter of 1939-40, the German High Command was working on the plans for the invasion of France and the Low Countries. The original plan, an advance through Belgium and northern France, repeating the strategy of 1914, had been modified dramatically. It had been replaced, after several rounds of argument and revision, by a plan of audacious genius. Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. The key element of the new plan was the main German armored force driving not through Belgium, but through the Ardennes, the forested, hilly terrain in Luxembourg and southern Belgium that military convention said was impassable for tanks. If it worked, if the Germans could push their armor through the Ardennes and reach the English Channel behind the Allied lines, the entire Allied force in Belgium would be cut off. The plan had been advocated most forcefully by a brilliant and aggressive tank commander named Erich von Manstein, who had been pushing variations of it since the autumn of 1939 against considerable institutional resistance from more cautious generals. When the plan was adopted, after a series of coincidences and accidents, including a German aircraft crash in Belgium that placed earlier German plans in Allied hands, It represented perhaps the most revolutionary military conception of the war. But before the German attack on France, there was one more act in the opening movement of this vast conflict: Norway and Denmark. On April 9, 1940, Germany invaded both countries simultaneously. Denmark capitulated within hours. It had no realistic option. Norway, with British and French assistance, fought for 2 months before finally being overcome. The Norwegian campaign was marked by Allied incompetence, forces arriving at the wrong ports, without adequate equipment, lacking coordination, outmaneuvered at every turn by German forces whose planning was superior and whose execution was more decisive. The Norwegian disaster had immediate political consequences in Britain. On May 7 to 8, 1940, the House of Commons debated the government's handling of the Norway campaign, and what emerged was one of the most devastating parliamentary indictments in British history. Speaker after speaker rose to criticize the government. Leo Amery, a senior conservative, quoted Cromwell at Chamberlain, "In the name of God, go." Chamberlain resigned on May 10, 1940. On the same day, Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. And the man who succeeded Chamberlain as prime minister, summoned to the palace by King George VI on the evening of the most dangerous day in Britain's modern history, was Winston Churchill. Churchill, who had spent the 1930s warning about Hitler while being dismissed as an alarmist and a warmonger. Churchill, who had been right about almost everything while those around him were wrong. Churchill, who would hold Britain together through the darkest years of the war with a combination of pugnacity, eloquence, and sheer force of will that remains one of the most remarkable performances in political history. But Churchill's finest hour was also Britain's most desperate. And the spring and early summer of 1940 would bring Britain, and with it, the entire Allied cause, to the edge of the abyss. Let us rest here in the stillness of this hour. The story has carried us far, from the peace conference of 1919 to the appointment of Churchill in 1940. The night is quiet around you. Let your breathing deepen. Let the words wash over you like a slow, gentle tide. There's more to tell. The fall of France in 1940 remains, nearly a century later, one of the most stunning military and political events in modern history. In 6 weeks, from May 10th to June 22nd, 1940, France, the dominant land power in Europe, a country that had survived 4 years of the most brutal warfare in history between 1914 and 1918, simply collapsed. It was as if a great building, appearing solid from the outside, had quietly rotted through on the inside, and only needed a single sharp blow to bring it down. The blow came on May 10th with the German invasion. 89 German divisions poured into France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Allied response, exactly as German planners had anticipated, was to advance into Belgium to meet the German thrust there. And as the British and French armies moved north, the real German blow fell behind them. 41 divisions, including 7 armored divisions, pushing through the Ardennes. The French commander in the Ardennes sector had been told, repeatedly, that this terrain was impassable for armored forces. He believed it. The forest roads of the Ardennes were indeed narrow and winding, but the Germans had spent months planning precisely how to move their armor through them, how to sequence the columns, how to deal with the traffic problems that inevitably arose. The operation was an extraordinary logistical achievement, executed with a speed that French intelligence simply could not process in time. Within days, German tanks were breaking out of the Ardennes and racing for the Meuse River. The French forces in the area were stunned. They had not expected armor here, had not prepared proper defenses, and found themselves overwhelmed before they could organize effective resistance. The Meuse was crossed on May 13th. By May 16th, the German armored spearhead was driving for the Channel. The Allied armies in Belgium were now in danger of being completely cut off. The British commander, Lord Gort, began to think not about counterattack, but about survival. Churchill flew to Paris on May 16th to consult with the French government and found, to his horror, that the French high command was already psychologically defeated. General Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, could not tell him where the strategic reserve was. It did not exist, Gamelin explained. France had no reserve. Churchill asked his French counterpart, Reynaud, what would happen if the Germans reached the Channel and cut off the Allied armies in Belgium. Reynaud looked at him with tired eyes and described, matter-of-factly, the collapse of France. Over the following days and weeks, that collapse unfolded with a terrible swiftness. By May 20th, German forces had reached the Channel coast, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force, the French First Army, and the Belgian Army from the main body of French forces to the south. By May 24th, the encircled Allied forces were compressed into a shrinking perimeter around the Belgian port of Dunkirk. And here history took one of its strangest turns. On May 24th, Hitler ordered his advancing armored forces to halt. For 2 days, the panzers that had been racing toward Dunkirk stood still, while the encircled Allied forces continued their retreat and began to organize what would become the most famous evacuation in military history. Why did Hitler order the halt? The full answer remains contested. There were practical military arguments. The tanks needed maintenance, and the flat canal-crossed terrain around Dunkirk was not ideal for armor. There was a political argument. Goering had promised that the Luftwaffe could finish off the Allied forces from the air alone, and Hitler was inclined to let him try. There may have been a strategic calculation that allowing Britain to save her army, while humiliated, might make a negotiated peace more attractive in London. Whatever the reason, the halt gave the British time. The evacuation began on May 27th. Over 9 days, from May 26th to June 4th, approximately 338,000 British and Allied soldiers were taken off the beaches of Dunkirk, carried by a fleet of naval vessels, merchant ships, fishing boats, pleasure craft, everything that could float and make the crossing. The image of those small boats crossing the Channel has become one of the defining images of British national mythology. Churchill, speaking to the House of Commons on June 4th, was characteristically honest. Dunkirk was, he said, a colossal military disaster. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. But he was also, in the same speech, characteristically defiant. He would end with the words that have echoed through the decades since. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Meanwhile, France was coming apart. A new offensive, Fall Rot, case read, began on June 5th. The French army resisted, sometimes heroically, but the strategic situation was hopeless. Paris was declared an open city, meaning the French government would not defend it, and German troops entered the capital on June 14th. Long columns of refugees clogged the road south, carrying what they could. The experience of the exode, the great migration of 8 to 10 million people fleeing the advancing Germans, scarred French memory for generations. The French government, which had moved to Bordeaux, was in turmoil. Those who wished to continue the fight, including Charles de Gaulle, a relatively obscure brigadier general who had distinguished himself commanding armored forces, were in the minority. On June 16th, the aged Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of Verdun and symbol of French military tradition, took over as prime minister and began negotiations for an armistice. De Gaulle flew to London. On June 18th, he broadcast a message to the French people over the BBC, a message so momentous, so unexpected, so audacious that it transformed a relatively unknown general into a historical figure. He said that France had lost a battle, but had not lost the war. He called on all French people who could fight, in France, in the colonies, anywhere in the world, to join him. The armistice between France and Germany was signed on June 22nd, 1940, in the forest of Compiègne, in the same railway carriage in which Germany had signed the armistice of November 1918. Hitler had insisted on this location precisely for its symbolic significance. The humiliation of 1918 was being reversed. This was his moment of triumph, and he savored it. But here is what the story of France's fall often obscures: the nature and meaning of France's defeat. France did not lose simply because of military incompetence or poor strategy, though both played a role. France lost because, in the deep sense, it had lost confidence in itself. in its political system, its social cohesion, its will to resist. The political divisions of the 1930s, left against right, workers against employers, Republicans against monarchists, and clericals against Catholics, had eaten away at the national fabric. The experience of the First World War, in which France had lost more than 1.5 million dead, had left a deep wound that was not healed by the 1930s. The pacifism that grew from that wound, the desperate desire not to repeat the sacrifice of 1914 to 18, was psychologically understandable but strategically crippling. There were also, it must be said, elements within France, significant elements, who preferred the German occupation to the continuation of a Third Republic they despised, and who were willing to collaborate with the conquerors in exchange for power. The Vichy regime that emerged under Pétain would spend the war years governing the unoccupied southern portion of France in close cooperation with Germany, implementing its own anti-Jewish legislation without being ordered to, and delivering French Jews to the deportation trains with an efficiency that shames France's memory to this day. The fall of France was also, for Britain, a moment of existential crisis. Britain now stood alone in Europe. All of its allies were conquered. The United States was neutral. The Soviet Union was Germany's partner. The British Isles were threatened by invasion. Hitler ordered the preparation of a plan, Operation Sea Lion, for a cross-channel landing. Only the channel itself, and the Royal Air Force, and the Royal Navy, and Winston Churchill's refusal to contemplate surrender stood between Britain and subjugation. And now we come to perhaps the most important question of the entire story of how the World War II began. Was there ever a moment, in the summer of 1940, when Britain might have negotiated? In May 1940, while the British armies were retreating toward Dunkirk and France was collapsing, a remarkable debate took place within the British War Cabinet. It was a debate that was kept secret for decades, and when it finally became known, it sent historians into a frenzy of analysis and argument. The debate was about whether Britain should explore the possibility of a negotiated peace with Germany. The man who raised the question was Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, and the man who had very nearly been appointed Prime Minister instead of Churchill on May 10th. Halifax was not a coward or a fool. He was a serious, intelligent man who looked at the military situation. France falling, Britain's army trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, the United States uninvolved, and drew what seemed to him the logical conclusion. If there was any chance of reaching a tolerable settlement with Germany through the mediation of Italy, which had not yet entered the war, it was worth exploring. The alternative might be the destruction of Britain's army, the fall of Britain itself, and conditions that would be far worse. Churchill disagreed. He disagreed, not just tactically, but in the deepest possible way. His view was that negotiating with Hitler was not a pragmatic option, but a moral and strategic impossibility. Hitler could not be trusted to honor any agreement. Whatever terms he offered would be worse than whatever he said they were. And once Britain began negotiating from weakness, she would lose the ability to resist, psychologically, diplomatically, militarily. There could be no compromise with what Hitler represented. The debate lasted, in various forms, across 3 sessions of the War Cabinet on May 26 to 28, 1940. It is worth sitting with the knowledge of what was at stake. Churchill was not, at this point, in an unassailable position. He had been Prime Minister for only 16 days. He did not have complete command of his cabinet. If Halifax had persevered, if he had convinced Chamberlain, who was also in the cabinet, to support his position, Churchill might have been forced to allow the exploration of peace terms. Halifax did not persevere. Chamberlain, after agonized deliberation, sided with Churchill. And on May 28th, Churchill addressed, not the War Cabinet, but a larger meeting of about 25 ministers. He told them that Hitler had been emboldened by the democracy's weakness, that whatever terms he offered would involve the reduction of Britain to a vassal state, and that he proposed to continue the fight. When he sat down, the ministers, according to Hugh Dalton, who was present, cheered and came to him and patted him on the back. It was one of the pivotal moments of the war, possibly of the century. But the question of what might have happened if Britain had negotiated or been forced to negotiate in the summer of 1940 belongs to the realm of counterfactual history. It is impossible to know. What we do know is that Churchill's refusal to entertain it was, in the short term, an act of extraordinary courage and, in the long term, one of the most consequential decisions of the war. Britain did not negotiate. Britain fought on. And over the following months, Britain's survival would draw other powers into the conflict, slowly change the global balance, and ultimately create the conditions for Germany's defeat. The story of the Battle of Britain, fought in the summer and autumn of 1940, in the skies above southern England between the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe, is one of the great stories of the war, and one that belongs more properly to the war's middle chapters than to its beginning. But it is worth noting here that the outcome was not inevitable. The RAF was being stretched to its limits. Airfields were being damaged, pilots killed faster than they could be replaced. If Germany had maintained its attacks on the airfields and radar stations rather than shifting, in September 1940, to the bombing of London, the RAF might have been broken. The shift to bombing London, the beginning of the Blitz, was itself the result of a specific incident, the accidental bombing of London by German planes on August 24th, which prompted Churchill to order retaliatory raids on Berlin, which infuriated Hitler, which caused him to redirect the Luftwaffe toward British cities. A single tactical error with profound strategic consequences. This is how history works, not in clean, inevitable progressions, but in chains of contingency, accident, error, coincidence, human frailty, and human courage, all intertwined. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the war was spreading. Italy had entered the conflict on June 10, 1940. Mussolini having decided that France was finished and that he wanted to be in on the winning side before the peace was concluded. He was, as he would discover, comprehensively wrong about the timing of the peace. But Italy's entry drew the fighting into North Africa and the Mediterranean, opening new fronts that would absorb vast quantities of men and materials. Japan was watching events in Europe with close attention. The collapse of France and the apparent weakness of Britain created enormous opportunities in Asia, French Indochina, British Malaya, and Burma, the Dutch East Indies. Japan had been fighting in China since 1937, in a war of enormous scale and brutality, and had been increasingly hemmed in by Western economic pressure and moral condemnation. The events of 1940 seemed to open a window, and in the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt was engaged in a complicated political struggle. He believed, deeply and correctly, that a German victory in Europe would be catastrophic for America's long-term security and values. He wanted to help Britain, but America was constrained by a Neutrality Act, by a powerful isolationist movement, and by the simple political reality that a presidential election was coming in November 1940, and no candidate could survive being seen as trying to drag America into a European war. Roosevelt navigated these constraints with extraordinary political skill. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement of September 1940, which gave Britain 50 old destroyers in exchange for leases on British bases in the Western Hemisphere, was legally questionable but politically achieved without requiring congressional approval. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941, allowed the U.S. to supply weapons and materials to Britain on credit, effectively making the U.S., as Roosevelt put it, the arsenal of democracy. But it was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, that finally brought the United States fully into the war and transformed it from a European conflict into a genuine world war. And it was Hitler's declaration of war on the United States for days after Pearl Harbor that bound the two conflicts together in a way that made German defeat, in the long run, almost certain. Why did Hitler declare war on America? He was not obligated to. The tripartite pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan required each party to come to the other's aid only if attacked, and Japan had attacked, not been attacked. But Hitler, flushed with confidence from the initial stunning successes of Operation Barbarossa, genuinely believed that Germany would defeat the Soviet Union before America could mobilize. He believed that declaring war would inspire Japan to attack the Soviet Union from the east, speeding the Soviet collapse. He did not seriously reckon with American industrial capacity and American willingness to fight. He was, and this isn't so much else, catastrophically wrong. The full story of why and how America entered the war is itself extraordinary, full of missed signals and political miscalculations and the specific decisions of specific individuals under impossible pressure. But its full exploration belongs to a different chapter of the story. For now, let us step back from the cascade of events and try to see the whole picture. Let us look at what all of this tells us about how the Second World War actually began. The answer is not simple. It did not begin on September 1st, 1939, when the German army crossed into Poland. That was merely the moment when a war that had been building for 20 years, that had already consumed Ethiopia and Spain and China, that had already swallowed Austria and Czechoslovakia, finally received its formal declaration. The war began in Versailles in 1919, when the peace settlement created conditions for resentment rather than reconciliation. It began in the beer halls of Munich in the early 1920s, when a failed artist and an embittered veteran found his voice and his audience. It began in the Wall Street offices of 1929, when the crash sent the global economy into collapse and created the desperation that radicalized millions of ordinary people. It began in the forests of Ardennes and the corridors of the Reichstag and the rooms of the Berghof, where decisions were made by a small number of people that would send tens of millions to their deaths. The war began every time someone looked at the evidence of what was coming and chose not to see it. It began every time a government calculated that someone else's suffering was worth tolerating to avoid the discomfort of intervention. It began every time a person of goodwill decided that the situation was not yet bad enough to require action. These are lessons we carry with us, not as accusations, but as knowledge. The knowledge that catastrophes grow from seeds, that warnings are given before disasters, that the people of 1930s Europe were not fundamentally different from us, not less intelligent, not less capable of kindness. They were human, and humans, left to their fears and their hopes and their ordinary desire to believe that things will work out, can stumble into catastrophes they never intended. Let's not judge them too harshly. Let us try instead to understand them, and in understanding them, perhaps understand ourselves a little better. All the history we have traced so far, the treaties and the elections and the diplomatic maneuverings and the military campaigns, has been, in its essence, a human story. But it is easy, moving through the grand sweep of events, to lose sight of the individual human beings whose lives this history disrupted, consumed, and ended. Tonight, as we move toward the end of our journey, let us slow down even further. Let us look not at governments and generals, but at ordinary people, the millions of ordinary human beings who lived through the years we have been describing, who made their own small choices in the context of the enormous choices being made above them, and whose lives were changed forever by events over which they had no control. Let us begin in Warsaw, in the winter of 1939-40. The German occupation has been in place for several months. The city is cold. The winter of 1939-40 is one of the harshest in memory. Coal is scarce. Food is rationed, and even the rations are difficult to obtain. The German occupiers have established a brutal hierarchy of privilege. Germans at the top, then foreign nationals, then Poles, and, at the very bottom, receiving the smallest rations and subjected to the harshest restrictions, the Jewish population of Warsaw. Warsaw's Jewish community was one of the largest in the world. Roughly 350,000 people, approximately 30% of the city's population. They were teachers, doctors, lawyers, merchants, tailors, artists, musicians. They had lived in Warsaw for generations, and many considered themselves, first and foremost, Poles. Their community had its own newspapers, schools, theaters, charitable organizations, a rich cultural life that had been developing for centuries. All of this was now being dismantled. Jewish businesses were confiscated. Jewish professionals were barred from their occupations. Jews were required to wear the yellow star. They were subjected to random violence, to forced labor, to humiliation. And in the autumn of 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto was formally established. A section of the city, its walls going up brick by brick, into which 350,000 Jews were forced. The ghetto was overcrowded, desperately so, with multiple families sharing single rooms that had once housed one family. Food allocations were barely above starvation levels, deliberately kept low, because starvation was one of the methods by which the German authorities intended to reduce the Jewish population. The people of the ghetto knew what was happening. They were not ignorant of their situation. And yet, and this is something that requires careful thought, careful compassion, not judgment, most of them continued to live. They organized schools in secret because education of Jewish children was forbidden. They maintained cultural organizations, underground newspapers, theatrical performances. They helped each other. They fell in love and argued and celebrated and mourned. They were human beings trying to remain human in conditions designed to dehumanize them. Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian who lived in the Warsaw Ghetto, organized a secret archive, codenamed Oyneg Shabs, in which dozens of writers, teachers, and ordinary people recorded daily life in the ghetto in meticulous detail. They buried the archive in milk cans and steel boxes, hoping it would survive even if they did not. It did. Parts of it were recovered after the war. It is one of the most extraordinary documents of human witness in history. Ringelblum himself did not survive. He was killed by the Germans in March 1944, along with his wife and son and the Polish family who had been hiding them. But his words survived, and through them, the voices of the ghetto speak across the decades, refusing to be reduced to statistics, insisting on their full humanity. Let us move from Warsaw to London in the autumn of 1940. The Blitz has begun. Every night, night after night, for months, German bombers come over the city. The air raid sirens sound, and Londoners descend into shelters, into the underground stations, into Anderson shelters in their gardens, into brick shelters in the streets. They bring blankets and books and sandwiches. They make tea. They sing songs. They sleep as best they can while the bombs fall above them and the city shakes. In the mornings, they emerge to assess the damage. Streets they have walked all their lives are suddenly gaps. Houses reduced to rubble, familiar landmarks gone. There are fires still burning from the night before. There are rescue teams digging through collapsed buildings, listening for sounds, pulling out people who are somehow, miraculously, still alive. There are also bodies being carefully removed, laid out with dignity, awaiting identification. The statistics of the London Blitz are sobering. Approximately 43,000 civilians killed, more than 1 million homes damaged or destroyed, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. But the Blitz also produced something remarkable, a solidarity, a darkly humorous resilience, a sense of community forged in shared danger that has passed into British mythology. Churchill visited bombed areas regularly, and the scenes of him walking through rubble, people cheering despite everything, weeping but determined, these were not staged, or at least not entirely staged. They reflected something real. A people who had expected terror and discovered in themselves an ability to endure that they had not known they possessed. But not everyone endured equally. It is worth noting that the Blitz fell disproportionately on the poor. The working-class neighborhoods of the East End, Stepney, Whitechapel, Poplar, were bombed far more heavily than the wealthier West End. In September 1940, a group of East Enders famously forced their way into the Savoy Hotel and demanded shelter, pointing out that if the Savoy's wealthy guests could take refuge in its reinforced basement, so could they. The management of the Savoy, after brief consternation, complied. This is war as it is actually lived, not only as grand strategy, but as the complicated, human-scale negotiation of survival and fairness and solidarity and its absence, all happening simultaneously. Let's move again, this time to rural France in the occupied zone in the years between 1940 and 1944. A village, let us say, somewhere in Normandy. Ancient stone houses, a church in the center, farms extending outward in every direction. The village has German soldiers billeted in it now, young men from Bavaria or Rhineland or Saxony, bored and homesick, and try not to look at what is happening around them. Life in occupied France had a texture of its own, an accommodation with the intolerable that was something more than collaboration and something less than resistance, and that most ordinary French people, when they remember this period, find deeply uncomfortable to discuss. There were collaborators, genuine ideological collaborators who embraced the new European order and actively worked with the German authorities. There were resistors, genuine, courageous individuals who risked everything to work against the occupiers, to hide Jewish neighbors, to pass information to London, to sabotage German installations. And in between was the vast majority trying to live, to feed their families, to maintain some semblance of normality in conditions that were anything but normal. A farmer who sold his crops to German requisitioners was feeding the occupier. Was he a collaborator? A shopkeeper who served German soldiers, because they were his only customers, was sustaining the occupation. Was she complicit? A teacher who taught her students the new curriculum, with its anti-Jewish content and its glorification of the Vichy regime. What was she? These are uncomfortable questions because they resist comfortable answers. Most ordinary people in occupied France, and in occupied Europe generally, were neither heroes nor villains. They were people trying to survive, making compromises they told themselves were necessary, and finding that the compromises, accumulated over time, had brought them further from where they had started than they had ever intended to go. The people who chose to resist, actively, at genuine personal risk, were exceptional. They knew they were exceptional. They chose their path with open eyes, knowing what the cost of discovery would be. The cost was often death, or the concentration camp, or the torture chambers of the Gestapo. And yet they chose it. Understanding why requires looking at something that statistics and strategies cannot capture. The inner life, the private moral reckoning, the moment when a person decides who they are. Jean Moulin was a French prefect, a senior civil administrator, who refused to cooperate with the German authorities from the very beginning. He was arrested and tortured in the early days of the occupation and attempted suicide to avoid compromising those around him. When he recovered, he went to London and threw himself into the service of de Gaulle's Free France movement. He was parachuted back into occupied France and spent 2 years organizing, coordinating, and unifying the various resistance groups that were operating in isolation and at cross purposes. In June 1943, he was betrayed. The identity of his betrayer remains disputed, and arrested by Klaus Barbie, the head of the Gestapo in Lyon, a man whose methods of interrogation were notorious. Moulin died in German custody, probably in late June or early July 1943, on a train to Germany. He never revealed the information he possessed. He was 44 years old. These are the faces behind the statistics. These are the individual lives, their courage and their compromise and their endurance and their endings that make up what we call the Second World War. There are millions of such faces. A Russian soldier at Stalingrad, writing a last letter home that will be found on his body months later. A Japanese civilian in Hiroshima, going about her morning routine on a summer morning in August 1945. A British sailor on a convoy in the North Atlantic, scanning the gray water for the wake of a torpedo that might appear at any moment. A Dutch child hidden in a secret room, learning to suppress even the sounds of breathing. A German soldier on the Eastern Front, writing in his diary about the cold and the mud and the fear and the strangeness of killing and being killed in a country thousands of miles from his home. All of them human, all of them real, all of them caught up in something that had started long ago with decisions made by other people in other rooms, decisions that had cascaded and compounded until the world was aflame from the Pacific to the Atlantic. We cannot honor them all by name, but we can try to hold them in mind. And we can try to understand that the war was not just a series of battles and campaigns and political decisions. It was the lived experience of hundreds of millions of human beings, most of whom never had any say in the choices that determined the shape of their lives. As we approach the end of our long journey tonight, let us turn, gently, to what came after, to the world the war made. The Second World War ended in 2 stages. Germany's surrender in May 1945 and Japan's surrender in August 1945 following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Between those 2 events lies a transformation of the world so complete that it is difficult, from our current vantage point, to fully comprehend what had been changed. The human cost alone staggers the mind. Estimates vary, but most historians now believe that the war killed between 70 and 85 million people, soldiers and civilians together, representing roughly 3% of the world population in 1940. The Soviet Union suffered the most, approximately 27 million dead, a figure so vast it still shapes Russian national psychology. China lost between 15 and 20 million. Germany lost between 6 and 9 million. Poland lost approximately 6 million, including approximately 3 million Jewish Poles murdered in the Holocaust. The Holocaust itself, the systematic industrial murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, including Roma, disabled people, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, and political prisoners, represents a crime so unique in its nature and so vast in its scale that it has required new language and new frameworks of understanding. The word genocide was coined specifically to describe it. The concept of crimes against humanity, now enshrined in international law, was developed partly to enable the prosecution of those responsible at the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials themselves were one of the most significant legacies of the war. For the first time in history, the leaders of a defeated nation were put on trial not merely for losing a war, but for crimes, for planning and waging wars of aggression, for war crimes against prisoners and civilians, for crimes against humanity. The principle that individuals, even heads of state and senior commanders, could be held criminally responsible for such acts was revolutionary. It remains controversial in its application and incomplete in its implementation. But the principle exists, and it exists because of what the Second World War revealed about the depths of human cruelty and the necessity of some framework of accountability. The political map of the world was redrawn. The European empires, British, French, Dutch, Belgian, had been weakened by the war, their invincibility shattered by the speed with which they had been conquered or compromised. The great wave of decolonization that washed over Asia and Africa in the 1950s and 1960s drew its energy in part from the war. India gained independence in 1947. French Indochina and British Malaya would see wars of independence that drew the great powers, particularly the United States, into devastating conflicts in Korea and Vietnam. The division of Europe into the American-aligned West and the Soviet-dominated East established the framework of the Cold War that would last for 45 years. Germany itself was divided into two states, West Germany and East Germany, that would only be reunited in 1990. The Iron Curtain that Churchill described in 1946 cut through the heart of Europe, separating families and cultures and economies in a division that shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people for 2 generations. The United Nations, founded in 1945 to replace the failed League of Nations, represented another attempt at the collective security framework that had failed so badly in the 1930s. It has had its successes and its failures, its moments of genuine international cooperation, and its humiliating retreats in the face of great power veto. But it represents, at the very least, an acknowledgement that the world of sovereign nations pursuing only their own interests, without any framework of rules or accountability, had produced catastrophes too large to be tolerated. The technology of the war, particularly the atomic bomb, developed by the Manhattan Project and dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, transformed the nature of war itself. The bomb's existence meant that a future great power war could be, for the first time, genuinely existential, a threat not just to nations or empires but to human civilization as such. This knowledge, terrifying as it was, produced the longest period of peace between major powers that Europe has known in recorded history. The Marshall Plan, the American program of economic aid to European reconstruction, launched in 1948, represented a deliberate choice not to repeat the mistake of Versailles. Instead of punishing the defeated, America helped rebuild them. West Germany, once the aggressor, became one of the most successful democracies in the world. Japan, once the aggressor in the Pacific, became one of the great economic success stories of the post-war era. The lesson learned, this time, was that reconciliation and reconstruction served peace better than punishment and resentment. Not every lesson was learned. Not every wrong was righted. The optimism of 1945, the sense that a new world was possible, foundered in many ways on the stubborn realities of human nature and the competition of interests. But some things did change. Some things changed profoundly and permanently. The world in which you live tonight, the international institutions, the human rights frameworks, the European project of integration and cooperation, the nuclear deterrence that has kept great powers from direct conflict, the decolonized map, the memory of the Holocaust embedded in international law and global consciousness. All of these things exist because of, and partly in response to, the Second World War. We live, still, in its shadow. We're shaped, still, by what it taught humanity about itself. The hour is very late now. The world outside is as quiet as it will get, settled into the deep stillness of night. And we have traveled very far together, through 2 decades of political desperation, through the rise of extremism, through the collapse of collective security, through the great military campaigns, and the individual human lives that were caught up in them. Now, as we approach the end of this journey, let us simply rest for a while in reflection. There's a question that I find myself returning to whenever I spend time with this history. Not what happened, we have traced that as carefully as we can, but what it means, what we are supposed to take from it. What lesson, if any, a tragedy on this scale can teach? I don't think the lesson is simple. I don't think it reduces to a slogan or a principle that can be stated in a sentence. The history is too complicated, the people involved too human, the causes too multiple and too interwoven for easy summary. But there are some things I believe we can say quietly at the end of a long night. We can say that the world the war destroyed was not destroyed by monsters, not entirely, not mainly. It was destroyed by ordinary people making understandable choices in difficult circumstances, choices that accumulated into catastrophe. This is sobering. It means that catastrophe is always possible. It means that the conditions that produced the 1930s are not unique to that decade or that place. We can say that warnings were given, and that the people who gave them were too often dismissed or ignored. The lesson here is not to be alarmist. Most warnings turn out to be excessive, but it is to take seriously the voices that say something is wrong, to investigate rather than dismiss, to maintain the ability to distinguish between fear-mongering and genuine prophecy. We can say that appeasement, in the sense of trying to satisfy an aggressor's demand without understanding what truly drives them, does not work. Not because dialogue is wrong, not because negotiation is a form of weakness, but because some demands are not about the stated object. They are about domination. And domination cannot be satisfied by concession. It can only be emboldened. We can say that the price of freedom, in the deepest sense, is a willingness to pay costs for others. Britain's survival in 1940 was partly its own strength and partly the solidarity of those who came to its aid. The courage of the French resistance, the sacrifice of the Polish soldiers who fought in other people's wars, the contribution of the colonial subjects who fought for empires that had never treated them fairly, all of these forms of solidarity were essential to the final outcome. A world that abandons each small cause because it is not our cause, and each small country because it is not our country, becomes a world in which no cause and no country is safe. And finally, we can say this, that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. The long failure that led to the Second World War was a failure to build a just settlement after the First. Versailles created resentment rather than reconciliation. The Depression created desperation rather than solidarity. The response to Nazi aggression was delayed and insufficient because the democracies could not agree on what was worth defending and what price they were willing to pay. After 1945, the world tried to do better. It did not fully succeed. It never does. History is not a story of final solutions, but of ongoing struggle, of imperfect achievements and recurring failures and the necessity of beginning again. But the attempt, the United Nations, the Marshall Plan, the European Project, the International Criminal Court, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, represents something important. An acknowledgement that the alternative to working for justice is working for chaos, and that chaos has a face we now know and a name we cannot forget. The world you will wake up in tomorrow is imperfect and complicated and full of its own dangers and its own temptations toward despair. But it is also a world that has been shaped, at least in part, by the knowledge of what a world without justice looks like, by the memory of what human beings did to each other between 1939 and 1945, by the determination, never completely realized, never completely abandoned, to do better. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, something remarkable. Let it be with you now, as sleep approaches. Let the knowledge of history settle around you. Not as burden, but as context, not as despair, but as understanding. The people we have spoken of tonight, the soldiers and the civilians, the resistors and the survivors, the statesmen who failed and the ordinary people who endured, they lived their lives with courage and fear and grief and hope, as all human lives are lived. They were not different from you in kind, only in circumstance. And the world they left behind, the world they fought to create, imperfect as it is the world you inherited, the world you live in, the world that, in your own small ways, every day, you are continuing to make. Sleep well, then. The stars are out above the city or the countryside or wherever you are tonight, the same stars that shone over the trenches of Normandy and the ruins of Warsaw and the beaches of Dunkirk and the broken streets of Stalingrad. The same star seen by all those different eyes, all those years ago, all those lives lived in the shadow of catastrophe. And here we are, on the other side, still here, still trying. That is enough for tonight. That is more than enough. Sleep. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.